So one thing that we added on to this week, or we started to get into, I kind of prompted it with a question that I asked on Friday, was what sort of training do you need to be more prepared to go through culture shock? And I asked some of you to explain what you would have wanted to learn or know or do before going through your culture shock experience. So we're starting to dig into some of those training concepts, and a lot of you had those initially. I think one of you mentioned journaling, one of you mentioned having sort of support systems, somebody to talk to share your experience, especially in regard to repatriation. And I think all of these are really good. I want to start digging in, and I hope that we can with the remainder of week 2. We'll see how far we get. And we can continue this conversation into week 3, but looking at the different training pieces. And I just wanted to share with you a couple, I guess, angles or important learning that I think does need to happen to deal with culture shock, and we'll be expanding on that. So one thing that you've touched on a little bit is you need preparation for culture shock. You need to have a sense of where you're going, what it's going to be like. And as deep as you can get with that before you go, the better prepared you are to then manage it and handle it when you get there, and maybe it can kind of break down some of those surprises. And that's culture specific things like about the country and politics and all of that. But even just talking to people from that country and being able to ask those questions, like what's the relationship between men and women in that country? What's the relationship between the poor and the rich? What are the classes like? Things like that, so you can kind of go in with some expectation, some understanding of what's happening. Not that it won't maybe still bother you or trigger those emotions, but just kind of having a general understanding can kind of help you deal with those. I think even more importantly is this cultural general process. You need to be emotionally prepared. Not to say that once you're emotionally prepared, you won't go through culture shock and it'll be fine. I haven't come across a case in the literature or in my own personal experiences where somebody went to another country for the first time and didn't experience some sort of emotional reaction or some sort of culture shock. That person may be out there, but I would be a little concerned if somebody actually went to another place for the first time and didn't experience any culture shock. I would think they were probably not in touch with either themselves or the culture. So it's kind of a tangent. But I think the best way then to prepare yourself emotionally and psychologically for culture shock and a sojourn, or even going to a different place, like one of you talked about going to Texas. And I think these are important points. You know, usually if you're moving to a different state, nobody gives a second thought to, do I need to do some intercultural training? Do I need to do some reflection? Do I need to find people who are already in that area and set up a support network? Those sorts of things you don't think about if you're traveling within the same country usually. But my point is to prepare yourself for these things emotionally. That's where the self-reflexivity comes in. And we're getting into that in week 3. That's going to be the point that we're really driving home. Some processes to go through to examine yourself, examine your own culture, and understand what's going on. Again, you'll go through the same emotional processes, but if you can understand your own perspective, your own culture, and why you're feeling this way, it can help you kind of cope with those emotions as you go through them and have a better understanding. I think that oftentimes the scariest part of culture shock is just confusion. Like, oh, I was expecting to be in this exotic, wonderful place, or whatever it was going to be, moving to the big city, and it was going to be amazing, but wait a minute, why do I feel so terrible? Why am I so depressed? What's going on? What's happening? At least with some self-reflexivity and preparation, understanding what you're going into, you can understand what's going on and kind of manage those things. One thing I learned about myself a long time ago, I had this life flow where every 2 years I moved to a different state, whether it was for a job or it was for grad school or whatever. And one thing I realized pretty quickly on that I thought was specific to me, and I don't think it really was, but it would take me 3 months to be happy where I was. And I knew I would get there, but it would take almost exactly 3 months for me, and I would feel kind of alienated. I always just kind of packed everything in my little Honda and left, and without any sort of support network in the new place I was going, or knowing what it was going to be like. I just moved. But it would take those 3 months for me to adjust, to understand what was going on, what to do. And some of that is even just understanding your location and where you are and not getting lost. But it's a broader emotional impact, I think. And so I think, as even some of you discussed, that's a light form of culture shock. Okay. Oh, and the last thing I think that kind of goes along with the self-reflexivity is preparing to grieve. There is some literature that talks about, especially I think we use it in my culture and conflict course, there's some literature that talks about when you are resolving conflict, a group that is letting go of some sort of bias or letting go of whatever grievance they have against another particular culture, part of that process, part of that conflict resolution is allowing that group to grieve the loss of identity. So I don't hate this group anymore, or I so long it's been part of my family, we understand that part of who we are is fighting with this group, or hating this group, or not believing with, this group is right. So I bring up this point because I think anytime you have almost this deculturation that you're going through, whether it's intentionally with conflict resolution or it's almost unintentionally, we talked a little bit about deculturation, I think in week 1, about that's almost a loss of some piece of cultural identity when you go to another place. So anytime you have that, it's not an easy process, and to really manage it, it takes grieving. So expecting to grieve some loss of what you're going through. And I can even think that this applies to a couple of you were talking about someone's experience, or maybe a couple of experiences that I mentioned before, of coming back to your home and it being a very different place than you left, or you being a very different person, or having evolved or learned new things, having deculturated in some sense of who you used to be or part of your cultural identity. And that again, it will take some grieving somewhere along the line to kind of let go of whatever cultural identity. And it's not necessarily bad. I mean, as with conflict resolution, it's not necessarily bad. And I think we kind of have to go through this deculturation and this acculturation as we go through life if we really want to build that cultural competency. But it's not an easy process, it's not something simple, and it's something that if we can just prepare ourselves to grieve the loss of it and realize that that's okay and that's a normal part of that process, again, it makes us aware of what's happening, why we're so sad about whatever this piece of us that is going, whether we can recognize a specific cultural identity that we're kind of losing or evolving or not. We still need to kind of see what's going on and to give ourselves the time we need to grieve that. And then the last piece that all of you really touched on was the importance of support systems and the chance to share stories. This is essential. If you're going to a different place, having that support network before and after. And even after you return, having somebody that you can share experiences with that isn't like, yeah, okay. Somebody who really wants to listen, somebody who can empathize and has gone through a similar process. Journaling is a great technique, or even blogging. I know that's becoming more and more popular, and that's even integrated into a lot of study abroad programs now too, requiring students to blog about their experience and to share with one another as they're going through it, and then even once they're returning from their experience abroad. So, So these were the kind of things, just to summarize: preparation, emotional preparation in terms of self-reflexivity, preparing yourself to grieve a loss of cultural identity, and having a support system. These are sort of the key components that if we're trying as trainers to prepare somebody for culture shock in any form, that we should be considering in the training that we design. And one thing I want to be sure we're not thinking about, or change our thinking maybe in a certain way, is that when I talk about training, I'm not talking about what's going to happen in a classroom before you go. I'm talking about something comprehensive and experiential. So the journaling is a part of it. The blogging is a part of it. We're thinking outside the classroom, as I like to say, to see where we can be the most impactful, where there are the most needs. It might be easier to do a class before somebody goes abroad, but if the bigger need is having a support group once they go abroad, maybe that's where, as trainers, we invest our time developing and creating those trainings or courses once they are abroad. So something to think about, so we're not limiting ourselves to just what can I do in this classroom with these 15 students. Okay.